Oh, hi! You caught me extolling the virtues of Denny's. Sorry, what's that? We're talking about Denny O'Neil? Damn it!
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Sometimes we don't realize how important somebody is to us until they're gone. And that was the case for me when writer and editor Denny O'Neil passed away just over a week ago at age 81. Now, I'd known that growing up I'd enjoyed a lot of his work, from Batman to Green Lantern, Green Arrow. But what I hadn't realized until I looked back at his entire history was just how many characters he'd co-created or series he'd written and edited that had touched me. We're talking about stories he shaped that in turn definitely shaped who I am. So what I think he did well when I look at everything was he found a way to ground his characters and make them believable. He found a way to strip away the superfluous and get to the core of a character and find a way to make it relatable. So today I want to take a look at Denny O'Neil's history and specifically what steps he took to make his characters believable. Before we continue, please consider hitting like and subscribe so that you can see more videos, and without any further ado, let's dive in. To understand Denny O'Neil's writing style, it's important to understand some of his background. First of all, he graduated from St. Louis University with a degree that focused on English literature, creative writing, and philosophy. Second, he served in the Navy after college. He was assigned to the USS Lake Champlain aircraft carrier. He was serving aboard when it was used as part of the quarantine around Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And finally, Denny describes himself as a hippie in the years following his service. So we have a guy that was formally trained in writing. We have a guy who served in the military during one of the most tense confrontations in modern history, the time when the US came its absolute closest to nuclear war, and a man who then went on to embrace social issues and caring for his fellow man. And I think all three of these elements help shape his writing style. Following his naval service, Denny obtained a job writing for a newspaper in a town 2 hours outside of his hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. Part of his job was writing for the paper's youth page every other week, and one summer he decided to write a piece on comics making a big comeback. That was seen by Roy Thomas, at the time the writer of a comic book fanzine, and soon to be employed at DC. When Roy made the switch to work at Marvel, he offered Denny the opportunity to take the Marvel Writers Test. Marvel was looking to hire some new writers because Marvel was expanding the number of their titles, and Stan Lee couldn't write them all. The test was 4 pages of Jack Kirby art that needed dialogue. Denny said he did not take it too seriously, but gave it a shot, and he was offered work at Marvel, initially writing books like Rawhide Kid and Millie the Model. He was instructed to ape Stan's writing style. In Denny's opinion, it was a good entry into comics because it was low pressure and it showed him how each step worked in the comics process. Stan passed most of his titles off to Roy Thomas, his protege, but O'Neil was assigned 6 issues of the Doctor Strange stories in Strange Tales. X-Men was a low-selling title, so O'Neil was teamed up with young artist Neil Adams in their earliest collaboration. One of their big moves was bringing Professor X back, who had previously died. Denny O'Neil did not make a big impression at the time with Stan Lee, and his writing assignments at Marvel began to dry up. Denny supplemented his income by working freelance at Charlton Comics, and he worked under the super plausible pseudonym Sergius O'Shaughnessy. But what was important was that he began working for artist and editor Dick Giordano. Giordano was shortly hired to work at DC Comics, and he brought Denny O'Neil with him, and that's where Denny started to make his mark. One of Denny's first assignments at DC was writing issues of Steve Ditko's new creation, The Creeper. He was crazy, but also had no superpowers, and his secret identity was a newspaper reporter. It was a good fit, but the title didn't catch on initially. Denny was soon given the reins to Wonder Woman, a title that wasn't selling well. Artist Mike Sekowsky had an idea for Wonder Woman to be more independent and teamed up with O'Neil to craft a story where Wonder Woman gave up her powers. From issues 179 through 212, Wonder Woman did not have superpowers, her magic lasso, or her indestructible bracelets. Instead, her mother and the other Amazons needed to leave this dimension to gather their powers. Wonder Woman didn't want to leave the world unprotected and stayed behind, also because she was in love with pilot Steve Trevor. Without her powers, Wonder Woman trained in martial arts under mentor I Ching and traveled the world as a type of spy. In between missions, she ran a fashion boutique. The new concept did not appeal to existing fans. Denny later said, quote, "I thought I was on the side of feminism." And the concept may have been, but to take away the powers and the mother of the most popular female superhero was not the way to proceed with this concept. This story is an early example of Denny O'Neil finding a way to find a more grounded, real-world take on a superhero, but it didn't work well for Wonder Woman specifically. Feminist Gloria Steinem famously wrote in her magazine Ms. about how it was not empowering at all to take away the powers and stature of the most famous female superhero. And DC agreed. They ultimately ended that run, but Denny's ideas of a more grounded take on a character would fit well on his next project. In 1970, Denny O'Neil was given another low-selling title, Green Lantern. He teamed up with artist Neil Adams, who was building a great reputation. Starting with issue 76, Green Arrow was added to the title. A few months earlier, Adams had updated Green Arrow's look from his original Robin Hood-inspired look to a more modern costume and a distinctive Van Dyke beard. O'Neil had stripped Green Arrow of his wealth to differentiate him from Batman, making him an urban hero that cared about social issues. The new grounded concept for the Green Lantern Green Arrow title gets set up right away. Green Lantern flies in to protect a businessman that's being pushed around near some apartments. But just after helping him, the public turns on Green Lantern, throwing trash at him. Green Lantern is confused, but Green Arrow jumps in and explains that the man was a slumlord, and Arrow is on the public side. Green Lantern is defensive, but Green Arrow argues his place is not on the streets. In perhaps the most reprinted page in all of comics, a black man tells Green Lantern that he's heard that he's helped orange skins and purple skins, but asks why he hasn't done anything for the black skins. Lantern is shamed. Denny and Neil would go on to have the superhero duo go on a road trip across America. During this time, Green Arrow would highlight to Green Lantern various social issues that were plaguing the country at the time, from racism to class issues to drug use. The writing style might be seen as heavy-handed by today's standards, but at the time it was relevant, it was fresh, and it helped make the title a hit. That image of Green Lantern dealing with white guilt had real feelings behind it and has been used more than any other image in comics aside from potentially the cover of issue 85, which they did, where they addressed the issue of drug abuse. In a two-part story beginning in issue 85, Green Arrow learns that his sidekick and ward, Speedy, has become addicted to heroin. The issues treated the topic with respect. 3 months earlier, Stan Lee had written some issues of Amazing Spider-Man, where Peter Parker's friend Harry Osborn is taking drugs, but those issues had him tripping out on fictional pills. Nevertheless, those issues were printed without the approval of the Comics Code Authority. The issues did get the Comics Code Authority to loosen their regulations, and the Green Lantern Green Arrow story came out just 3 months later with the approval of the organization. Denny O'Neil has admitted in interviews that he was dealing with his own issues with addiction during this time, specifically alcohol. That said, he has admitted that he did not intentionally write these issues to address his own demons, but says that it's possible that could have been subconscious. Nevertheless, these issues were socially relevant, and he would go on to be honored in 2018 with an award from the Jimmy Carter Presidential Museum for his work in socially conscious comic books, specifically the stuff he was writing in the 70s with Green Lantern, Green Arrow. Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams proved their worth to DC Comics on Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and the company soon gave them a bigger assignment, working on issues of Batman and Detective Comics. Together, they ultimately produced 11 issues together, and their run is noted for being a much more serious take on Batman. Some of that credit should also go to editor Julius Schwartz, who had the teams on the two titles take things more seriously. That was in direct response to the popular but campy 1960s Batman TV show. O'Neil said that he was first offered the chance to write Batman when the show was still on, but he felt his sensibilities were not suited to camp. He also didn't particularly find the idea of people not taking Batman very seriously a funny joke. But shortly after it ended, he agreed to take over the title and made some important additions to Batman's mythos. A lot of fans and critics will point to books like Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One, or The Killing Joke as a darker, more serious Batman story. But O'Neil did a lot for Batman over a decade earlier than those stories. He brought Two-Face into the Bronze Age of comics. Two-Face had only been used twice in the 50s and once in the 60s, but O'Neil and Adams made him a dangerous, unhinged threat that elevated his stature. The duo also co-created Ra's al Ghul, an eco-terrorist determined to bring down modern society. These stories brought Batman out of Gotham City and took him on more James Bond-esque globe-trotting adventures against a criminal who was a threat to the world. Even then, O'Neil would add panels and issues to explain that Batman remained committed to keeping his city streets crime-free. One of O'Neil's and Adams's biggest achievements, and a personal favorite of mine, was updating Joker. Joker had become more of a prankster throughout the 50s and 60s, but in the terrific story Joker's Five-Way Revenge, they brought the character back to his psychopathic roots in a story where Batman is trying to protect some of Joker's previous henchmen from being murdered by him. Joker became a serious and unpredictable threat. In one of O'Neil's stories about Ra's al Ghul from Batman number 242, O'Neil and artist Irv Novick introduced Bruce Wayne's undercover disguise, Matches Malone. The character would continue to appear whenever Batman needs to infiltrate the criminal underworld. O'Neil also wrote the classic story There's No Hope in Crime Alley in Detective Comics number 457, with artwork by Dick Giordano. That story introduces Leslie Tompkins, a kind lady that is revealed to have comforted Bruce Wayne the night his parents were murdered. Tompkins would go on to be developed into a doctor who ran a clinic in the city and a caretaker of young Bruce Wayne. Leslie Tompkins is a great example of what I'm talking about when I say Denny O'Neil wrote grounded characters. By that I mean she was based on something from the real world. Specifically, she was based on the social activist Dorothy Day. In addition to this, a lot of the writing would be seen today as wordier than what we're expecting, but what O'Neil did well was he found a way to strip away the extraneous and get to the core of a character. Batman became a psychologically intense, driven character. Robin was removed and sent off to college, so Batman was a loner. This really was the beginning of the Batman that we recognize today. O'Neil had a lot of success with DC in the 70s, including a run on Superman where Superman begins to lose his powers, a team-up with Adams featuring Superman and Muhammad Ali in a boxing match, and a dark and moody take on pulp hero The Shadow with artist Michael Kaluta. O'Neil then returned to Marvel in 1980. He wrote Amazing Spider-Man for a year, introducing recurring characters Madam Web and Hydro Man. More importantly, he wrote 2 annuals for Spider-Man, which both featured the artwork of newcomer Frank Miller, after he had tried to break into comics for years with the tough advice he got from Neil Adams. Miller and O'Neil would go on to collaborate on Daredevil a few years later in a seminal run. One run Denny had that I think gets overlooked was his run on Iron Man from 1982 to 1986. He brought back Tony Stark's alcoholism, and because of O'Neil's past, he did so in a believable way. He made the problem so serious that Stark handed over the Iron Man identity to his friend Jim Rhodes. This era also introduced an updated armor known as the Silver Centurion, and the threat of rival businessman Obadiah Stane, who would go on to become the Ironmonger. Introducing a new person behind the Iron Man armor, and a black person at that, was a big deal in 1980, and a successful one. People like the character of Jim Rhodes. A lot of the issues that Denny O'Neil introduced in these issues, from the alcoholism to Jim Rhodes being an important character to Obadiah Stane, were all used in the first Iron Man movie. When O'Neil returned to Marvel, one of his duties was editor, and he was working on Daredevil when artist Frank Miller debuted on issue 158. Miller wanted to tell his own stories, and Denny ultimately took the writer Roger Mackenzie off the low-selling title and gave Miller a shot as both artist and writer as of issue 168. Miller slowly turned the nearly canceled title into one of Marvel's A-list titles, as he introduced elements like The Hand, Mercenary Ninjas, and Elektra, Daredevil's former lover and now an assassin for hire. Miller built up Kingpin as an archenemy and brought tragedy to Daredevil's life when he had villain Bullseye kill Elektra. Now, that's all stuff that Frank Miller accomplished, but it's important to understand Denny's editorial style. Denny has said that there's more to being an editor than just shepherding the book from, artist to letterer to colorist to publication. What he would do would be to read the stories and offer his feedback constantly, every issue. He would read the story that the writer prepared, and then he would find any problems within them. He'd approach the writer with a solution in mind, but often would allow the writer to correct it themselves. Basically, he prevented them from putting out a bad comic book. His role as being a sounding board really adds a lot to comics. Every editor works a little differently, but it's not quite a co-writer, but it's a lot more than just sort of signing off and passing the issue to the next person and keeping schedules working. For Denny, it really was coming up with solutions to make the story better. An example. He suggested to Frank Miller that he give Daredevil a plausible fighting style, and that inspired Frank Miller to add all the ninja elements that were a huge hit in Daredevil. When Miller moved on from the book, O'Neil wrote Daredevil for a few years. It's a solid enough run, but can be jarring, shifting from Miller's hugely successful run to O'Neil's very different style. One important character he introduced was Yuriko Oyama. Her father was the criminal scientist who invented the process to bond adamantium to bone, and Daredevil's injured enemy Bullseye went to him to get an upgrade. Daredevil met Yuriko on the way. Later, other writers turned her into the cyborg villain Lady Deathstrike, going after people like Wolverine, who had used her father's adamantium bonding. When Denny O'Neil was ready to step down from Daredevil, Frank Miller returned for the acclaimed Born Again story arc. While Denny was at Marvel, he also edited G.I. Joe, written by Larry Hama. He was the editor on that title from its inception in 1982 through 1986. G.I. Joe was Marvel's best-selling subscription title in 1985, and while most of that credit should be handed to Hama, O'Neil was there as a sounding board and to get great artists like Michael Golden, Mike Zeck, Herb Trimpe, and others to contribute. Because of his involvement with G.I. Joe, Marvel also consulted O'Neil when they began discussions with Hasbro to adapt Transformers for them. Among Denny's contributions were the idea that the cars should all be the good guys and that the leader should be named Optimus Prime. Optimus Prime, G.I. Joe. These were the two things that got me into comic books as a kid. Without realizing it, Denny O'Neil was a key factor in my journey to discovering comic books. By 1986, O'Neil returned to DC for the rest of his comic book career, principally as the editor on Batman. He would also write some Green Arrow and a new version of The Question with artist Dennis Cohen. 3 street-level characters, which were the place Denny excelled. They would all appear in crossover annuals with one another. On Batman, O'Neil was the editor when Jim Starlin and Jim Aparo created their story Death in the Family. The gimmick DC came up with was that readers could vote on whether the second Robin, Jason Todd, would live or die. Readers decided Joker would kill Robin. Denny has said in interviews that this was the moment he realized that he was now responsible for some very important American mythology, or as he called it, a custodian of folklore. In a 2014 interview with 13th Dimension, O'Neil explains how he learned this. Quote, I went to a deli on 5th Avenue to buy a sandwich for lunch, and like Julius Schwartz, I wore a little Batman pin. So the guy behind the counter leans over and he remarks on it. I mention who I am and he says, hey, this is the guy that killed Robin. Now, this guy probably hadn't seen a comic since he was a kid, but to everybody, these characters had been all over the place. They have become folklore figures. This was the second time O'Neil was involved with removing Robin from the Batman title, because when Julius Schwartz first approached O'Neil and said, hey, would you like to write Batman? O'Neil said, you know what, I'm really more interested in just writing Batman as a solo character. That inspired Julius Schwartz and writer Frank Robbins to come up with the story to have the first Robin, Dick Grayson, go off to college and clear the way for O'Neil's run. But he would go on to have even more influence in more recent Batman mythology. During his time as editor, O'Neil oversaw the epic Knightfall storyline, where new villain Bane was introduced, broke Batman's back, and Batman's new protege Azrael took over. O'Neil and artist Joe Quesada co-created Azrael. O'Neil knew that this would be a long storyline across a few titles comprising, as he has said in interviews, about 1,200 pages of story. He oversaw the idea, which called for Batman to be taken out and for a new, more unstable Batman to be installed, who was a reflection of the grim and gritty anti-hero trends of the 90s. He pitched the story to his superiors several times to make sure everything was lined up and approved. Then he learned that the Superman team was killing Superman just before their Batman story. Apparently, this was just poor communication, and Denny O'Neil has admitted that it's far from ideal because readers had just been exposed to a somewhat similar idea of a main character being removed from his title for a prolonged period of time. But Knightfall was underway. It was happening, and then, way too late to stop the process, a higher-up executive at Warner Brothers caught word of the storyline, and he was aghast. He was like, you can't remove the original Batman, Bruce Wayne, from the story. So, a compromise was made. Bruce Wayne would be checked in periodically throughout Knightfall to check on his road to recovery. Denny O'Neil has said that this really sapped the story of its potential impact because readers could reasonably assume that at some point Bruce Wayne would be coming back. Whereas, if they'd been allowed to remove Bruce Wayne from the title for a year, readers could be thinking, well, they did kill Robin. Could they really have eliminated Bruce Wayne? Nevertheless, Knightfall was a big sales success, and O'Neil oversaw other big Batman stories like No Man's Land. A lot of his writing and editing of Batman informs the Christopher Nolan trilogy of films. In the late 90s, O'Neil taught writing courses at Manhattan School of the Visual Arts, and in 2001, he wrote the book The DC Comics Guide to Writing before going into semi-retirement, only popping up to write novelizations of Batman films up through Dark Knight. Denny has spoken in interviews about the challenges of maxi series like Knightfall, and while I love his work, I can't say it's all perfect. For instance, he co-wrote Armageddon 2001, a DC Comics crossover in 1991 that promised one superhero would be revealed as becoming the future supervillain Monarch. By the end, it was clear that Captain Atom was intended to be that hero, but the information got leaked and DC had O'Neil hastily rewrite the final issue to reveal that street-level hero Hawk of Hawk and Dove was the villain. It didn't make any sense, and it was a huge flop. But even when I point something like that out, it's clear that the blame doesn't lie with O'Neil primarily, as much as with higher-level editors. The fact is, O'Neil was great at street-level superheroes. Green Arrow, Question, Batman, Daredevil. He's had a huge hand in developing all of them and giving each of them some of their most important mythology. He brought real-life issues to the table in his stories and focused on building believable personalities. The fact that Denny had a hand in developing ideas for G.I. Joe and Transformers just meant that he was making a big impression on young Chris's mind. And I think that a lot of his stories that I was exposed to at an early age that were socially conscious may have helped made me a more compassionate human being for my fellow man. When you look at the work he's done, it's sad that he's gone, but the fact that stuff that he wrote in the 70s was still being used in several movie adaptations in the 2000s speak to the fact that a good story will always outlive its creator. I've got a few more things to say about Denny O'Neil's writing style, but let's take a quick look at what fan art came into the channel this week. Daniel Victoria sent in this comic strip featuring an alternate ending to the Dynamite Thor comic I reviewed. James Cole illustrated me with the rocky power of the Thing, but my handsome looks. The Cowled Clown drew me in a Liefeld style, but with the note to the colorist to fill in the background. He includes a link to his YouTube channel where he flips through his comics. Juan Carlos Sanabria Villarroel shows us all that I Hulk out when I read a bad comic. He has more art on his Instagram. Simbonenfant created artwork where I'm showing off a dynamic pose. You can see more at the Instagram link. CL Proper sent in this artwork featuring me in my scale Sona after they saw my episode on Black Sad. Christian Brown illustrated me as the tiny Hank Pym with his robot creation Infiltron chasing me. He has more on Instagram. Mark Cousin watches the show with his sons and gave me permission to share this artwork by his 7-year-old son Henry, who illustrated me as a bone cousin. Fantastic. Finally, Jake Bauer shows us what would happen if I got to live my dream. I'm Iron Fist. Folks, I'm always happy to share any artwork that you want to send in as long as it has something to do with this channel specifically. Just send it into this address, comictropes@gmail.com. I will share it, and then I will pick one of you to get a Gachapon prize. So, there were 10 entrants. Let's spin the ball hopper and see who won this week. There we go. And it is going to be number 8. So that was this artwork. And let's see what you won. And then I'll share my final thoughts on Denny's work. Let's see. Gotcha Pond. Reach in and, oh, looks like it's some sort of a Terminator skull. This opens up and there's something inside. I really don't know what, but that's a pretty unique one. Don't know exactly what this is, but I will send that your way, number 8. When I talk about grounded work, what I'm talking about is when an artist finds a way to get a take on a character that's relatable. Stripping away some of the more fantastical elements sometimes. He's done that in his stories where he takes away a character's money or powers or sidekicks. But it's really just trying to focus on street-level crime in a lot of his stories, or at least get to the core of a believable personality. So that's what I mean when I talk about grounded. And I think that's something Denny O'Neil did very well. On top of that, the fact that he brought in real-world social issues helped make comics more relevant and helped them grow up. I think that comics could have easily faded away if they didn't find a way to do things differently. And that said, comics originally started talking about social and political issues. The early Batman and Superman comics absolutely addressed that stuff. And then in the 50s and the 60s, it got a little more camp and a little sillier. But by the end of the mid-60s, really, mid to end 60s, it started getting a little more serious. But Denny O'Neil was definitely somebody that helped them grow up and made it more plausible. And that was because he had real-world experience to draw from. You know, he'd served in the military. He went to college and got an education. He wrote for a newspaper. He kept up to date with the issues of the time. He was a caring individual, and it is sad that he's gone. I feel like maybe this is just me getting older, but that 81 isn't necessarily that old. He seemed to be doing well. You know, he was doing interviews relatively recently and stuff, and he seemed healthy, and so it is sad to lose somebody like that. He had really retired, though, somewhere around 2001, and so hopefully he was able to enjoy his retirement. And what's nice is, you know, we got a lot of his work, and I don't know what it will be like, but apparently he did come out of his retirement to do another Green Lantern, Green Arrow story that will be released like very, very soon, maybe this week or within a month, something like that. That's pretty amazing. Still thinking creatively like that. I hope that we all should be so lucky as to have our minds be that active and engaged that we still want to tell stories about our fellow man all the way up until the end. So, thank you, Denny. You helped shape a lot of young Chris's interest in comic books, and I thank you for that. If nothing else, thank you so much for your help getting me interested in comics. I hope you've enjoyed this taco about Denny, and I want to let you know that my fellow comic book YouTuber Owen Likes Comics is about to do a deep dive into Denny's run on Batman. So if you enjoyed this and you want to go a little deeper in Denny's work, I definitely recommend checking that out. Thank you to my patrons. Keep reading comics. Wait, why is a cheeseburger wearing a taco?